Jack me, are you? Anyway, I'm spilling a little on the curb here for Mano from 11.5 who passed away. And 11.5, they were kind of like my crew. I just love those guys. And I was so fortunate to get to collaborate with them. That all happened as a joke in the studio in San Francisco when we were just smoking weed outside. But, the whole Killaho, and I mean, it all ties in with so many of these great artists from San Francisco that we have discussed today that, they were all like down with this. And so many great people were down with the whole Killaho crew. And speaking of Bay Area compilations, the Killaho compilation is good. And I was like pretty blessed to have been associated with all of these great guys.
You'll never know I was that age when we engaged. Satchel Paige, all on the front page, right our way. Maximum output. Satchel Paige, Satchel Paige, Satchel Paige.
Magnificent. 1990. The other thing too about the click was when these are valuable. See, that's the click. They roll deep.
Damn.
Okay. So we got. When I first heard the click, they weren't even the click. They were MVP, Most Valuable Players, and Sugar T was not there with them in this. So this one came out in '88, and that was the first single. Thought I Could Trust a Girl, The King's Men, Sugar and Spice, Honey Boom. That one with Sugar T on there guesting. Anyway, so that was what led to the formation of the click, and over City Hall Records, who I started going over to. This is from the mid '80s onwards, and I would get advanced promo copies of different records. So they used to distribute all of the early Sick With It Records ones and send them out. And then Solar Music Group would send out the things, and this was St. Charles, who was E40's uncle, I believe, ran this. And the thing about the click, E40 and then of course, Let's Side. And then of course they got signed to Jive Records. And the thing about the click is that when Sick With It, they used to, sometimes what they do is they would put, like, if this year is 2021, they would put on 2022 as the release date. So sometimes they would trick people into doing it. So you always have to look twice. But anyway, with the click, E40 was definitely, like, musically such a unique voice. And I mean, the whole crew, the whole quartet is amazing. But his voice was so unique and so unlike anything else people had heard that a lot of people at first, they were like, oh man, I can't get with that guy. He just like raps too fast. He's like, blah, 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 blah. And young kids could get into it. I remember back, at the time of these early releases at the beginning of the 90s was quite different for unlike anything anyone had ever heard. But once they got into it and they realized that not only was his voice unique, but his whole slanguage, everything he said, they totally got into it, because it's just like, it transcends just like some artists making music. It was like a whole sort of a culture with its own language, literally. But anyway, from a business point of view, what I admire so much about E40 and the click was these guys hustled their asses off. So from when I met them, this is like the pre-Jive, before they got signed to the major label, and they were running their own thing and making lots of money. Again, because they took all of the profit. And the whole rap game, the independent rap game was revolutionary here in the Bay Area. Too Short kind of led the way out the trunk, and then E40 came along. Master P, he took notes of all of this, and he took it and perfected it to another level, and kind of along the same way. But for the click and E40, not only did they elevate the business game, by doing all this, but artistically they were also just sort of taken to another level. And in a way, it was sort of good that they got signed so that they didn't have to worry with all the day-to-day business things from running a label. And the click, I think, and it's amazing how E40 and like Too Short are still around today and still relevant today, and what influential artists they will forever be. For an early Mystic Journeyman tape. And it's crazy how it's like art. How can you put a value on it? Someone might do a painting and it's worth $1, or it's worth $1 million. And the same thing is sort of happening with a lot of the early underground Bay Area rap slash hip hop releases. And the most rare of them, like it'll be the one, it might even be like some, gangster rapper who put out one tape, a guy from like, say, Tracy, California, and he might have put out one tape in 1996, but he made 300 copies. And people go crazy for it. They want to spend like $1,000. But a lot of the early stuff from the Bay Area, so much of it was all independent that those things are in big demand. So things can sell for anywhere from $500 to $1,000, provided someone is willing to pay for it. So EPA, I like to think that Totally Insane were one of the artists that really helped put East Palo Alto, or East Palo Alto as sometimes people would call it back in the day, on the map. And there's so many great artists from there when you stop and you think about it, including Chunk, of course. And East Palo Alto was a city that there was so many different, I mean, there's the EPA compilation, I don't know if you know that one.
Dead on Arrival, right?
Yeah, and that one too is just incredible. And so many great artists. And I would venture to say, with like Sean T, Chunk, Funk Lab All Stars, so many people from Palo Alto that, it had its own unique style, just like Vallejo had a distinctive style. And that's the thing about, the regional rap, as it was called back then, is that the Bay Area was very distinctive. And even within the Bay Area, these different cities and different places, and Sacramento, the hardcore, it's more than a coincidence that Brother Lynch Hung and X-Rated have that sort of hard horrorcore style. And so many people like from Sacramento, and then when you get in like Fresno, Tracy, different places like in California, we're going beyond the Bay Area, but they're all linked, and they all have their own different styles. Earlier I talked about the Darkroom Familia. They had a very distinctive style too. And that's all part of Northern California, Bay Area, rap music, history, and culture. SIC were one of the myriad, dozens upon dozens of different artists come out of East Palo Alto. And I remember working with them at the time with their marketing and sort of interviewing them and doing some stories for, I forget what magazine, but they were, a group who, again, had a great, unique style. And they got out there a fair amount, but not nearly as much as they deserved to. And when you go back, it's unfortunate because it really is it's the way life is. It sucks for most people. Most people are struggling. And some of the greatest artists that I've come across, they're working, 2 jobs, a security guard at night and working in somewhere else in the daytime. And these are people who made some incredible music, and there's so many out there, tragically, especially here in the Bay Area where we've lost so many great rap slash hip hop artists. You hear about them when they die and you're like, oh, this guy, remember he was such, and it's tragic, but a lot of people, they're still alive and they're doing things, but they're not making a living from the music, and they're in a perfect universe, they would be. And there's so many artists like SIC who I think qualify for that. So many. I'm just thinking of there was another group, Blackjack. They were also from, I believe, Palo Alto. They were signed to Tommy Boy for a minute. And, at that time, so many artists, they were like, oh, this is it. This is our break. And, if you looked around, you'd think, yeah, I'm about to blow up nationally, because that's just the way it was. But then at a certain point, everything kind of just stopped, and the industry shifted as well. And then, of course, with the whole internet and downloading, everything changed yet again. So it's an ever-evolving thing artistically and from a sort of a business standpoint. But anyway, no, the first time I heard Totally Insane would have been in '92. And I brought here a couple of their pictures of the early press releases. This is like from the In a Minute days.
Oh, shit.
And again, Totally Insane, an amazing group, but ahead of their time. Like, as they would say, fools be sleeping, they couldn't get in with it. And many things, like throughout the years with Totally Insane. And this is when they were on In a Minute. We're all a little insane, so why not go all the way? Go Totally Insane, direct from the back street.
Oh, shit.
And, you know, the connection, of course, TC, the producer, who also worked with RBL. So everything kind of tied together. And that's, again, another example of how close-knit the Bay Area rap/hip-hop community was. Artists constantly collaborating, and there was always like some relation. You know, Mac Mall and Dre Dog connecting. All these different people. It was not uncommon. JT the Big Figure. You know, so many different people working with others within the Bay. And it's always been a tradition, I think, in the Bay Area more than any other city. Did you see the interview I just did with him? I mean, that I did with him back in the day?
Was that with the Giants jacket on, that thing, or?
It's like, yeah. We're outside the record store, like standing on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just posted like about a month ago. No, 2 months ago maybe. But anyway, but I went, by doing that, I was sort of reminded of all the different things. So, Dre Dog is an example of an artist who somehow has managed to still be here and be relevant, doing things. I went to the his big Andre a Nicotina Fair, Andre Day, like that he had at the New Parish in 2021, the end of October 2021, and RBL Posse were in the house. But it's like, it's crazy how 3 decades, 30 years later, Andre Nicotina is still relevant and still doing things. He's currently working on a new comic book series, Kill a Whale. And then Kill a Whale, just like Chinese Cat and everything else, it all kind of ties back in. You know, this guy from when he was young, coming up in the Fillmore, had a vision and had this kind of quirky mind that it was just kind of weird, you know, some of the things he would do, but brilliant. And as a result, he's managed to have this long career. But the blueprint for it all goes back to the new Jim Jones. And what an amazing album it really was. That, you know, and again, I think it's an example of people not, you know, at the time compared to now, people I think can appreciate it more overall. But I think that Dre Dog is a pretty incredible artist and who will just sort of continue to do stuff. Also, things that he's done since then, collaborated with different people, including Equipto from Board Stiff, are pretty darn good. The Mac, The Game is Thick, Kyrie. Okay. The Mac, 1990, Strictly Business Records. Mac Mall, Young Black Brother. Kyrie would do this. Don't Give Up. This is early 90s. Producer Kyrie, who has produced and or written for X-Ray, En Vogue, Vanilla Ice, Vallejo. X-Ray. So Young Black Brother Records, then there was also Strictly Business Records, which is where this appeared on, as well as Romp Records, Romp Productions. Too hard for the fucking radio. The Click. Game Recognized Game in the Bay, man, is, if you were to pick one song as a Bay Area anthem, I think that one qualifies. There's many others, and there's many specific ones to, like San Francisco or to Oakland or to different individual cities or areas, but and there's so many songs that people can relate to. Chatting earlier, we mentioned someone who, freaks of the industry, they considered a Bay Area anthem. And then I was thinking how you could also consider I Got Five on It, the remix with everyone on it, as a Bay Area anthem too. But game recognized game, I think, truly is a distinctive thing. And also, JT the bigger figure, I think it's real important when you look at like Bay Area rap history, hip hop history, is to trace the careers of the people. Some people, they're still, like I mentioned, how Dre Dog, Andre Nicotina, is still doing his thing and will continue to innovate and create. But also, JT the bigger figure, who has gone to live in Africa and has like a whole YouTube channel of, going over there with his family that I highly recommend people check out. And it's also interesting because JT the bigger figure, coming up, and then, San Quinn, another artist, started out very young out of the Fillmore district. But JT, from a young age, was, with Get Low recordings, he was very business minded as well as artistically minded. And he just applied himself. And I think he is an example of, this hustle / entrepreneurship attitude that so many people in the 90s, early 90s particularly, from the Bay Area who ran their own labels possessed. And really they shone. It was amazing. They really shined. And he is a good example of that, of one of those people. And when going back, there's so many different landmark releases associated with Get Low. Really? Again, rap music was considered this sort of this gimmick, a disposable thing, a novelty that would be over next week and forever and ever. So then I became a DJ on the radio, and then I would play it. Now, in the early 80s as a DJ, and I would also listen to the radio. So K-Soul, which morphed into Wild 107 later on. Anyway, they would have like some of the best music, and they would do like these mixes in the middle of the day, and they had like great DJs there. And Marcus Gutierrez was one. So these DJs in the Bay Area, before the internet, were very influential for, getting out this music. And of course, back then, it was a lot of electro, kind of, the up-tempo, sort of like Miami Bass. I mean, it was electro, Africa Bambaataa, and everybody from New York making all this incredible music. And then also in LA. But the music started coming out, and like there would just be new people all the time, and different releases. And like, for example, the Fat Boys came out, and people were like, wow! And it was true. And I would say that in terms of like, spitting gas, that one, hearing them was one of those things that just stopped you in your tracks and these records were all just sort of coming out. And another thing about them was that, with hip hop and rap, there was only so much of the music. So if you listen to DJs like on the radio, as I mentioned, like K-Soul, where I would listen to, and then Calax is where I would DJ. If you were playing it, if you couldn't really do an all rap show, because you would play like Prince, you play funk as well, Michael Jackson, you play like a lot of the funk. You throw in, of course, P-Funk, Funkadelic in there. But as time went on, there was more and more people spitting serious gas that, just sort of blew your mind. And that, I think, up to a certain point, I would say up to like the mid 90s was when it went beyond that. So at a certain stage in hip hop, whether you were, and if you listen to old interviews with Shock G, rest in peace, from Digital Underground, he talks about in the late 80s when Digital Underground were forming, and they're totally into P-Funk, they were very particular about the samples they used. So they wouldn't, if you as an artist used, say, a certain sample from a certain Funkadelic album, they were like, oh man, we can't put that out, because it was about originality, not just in production and choice of samples, but also in your flow. So, all the time when you heard a new artist come out, an MC, they would be spitting fire because that's how they got out, because they had to be unique. And I think by maybe the mid to late 90s, that kind of just went away. Nowadays, there's no shame in sounding like someone else. But, people still have them on the major label, and helps get the group out there internationally as well as just locally. And then people sort of started to catch on to, the incredible, unique wordsmanship of E40, 40 Water, the man. He's got Trump Tower. Because I did this thing where I had a picture of Trump, and I was like, oh shoot, look, I put the two back to back. But E40 is the man, and Hall of Game kind of helped as, him as a solo artist as well as with the click, but it helps, sort of further spread the word of 40 Water, and I cannot say enough good things about the artist. Be Legit Hemp Museum, yeah, Be Legit, very talented. And that's the thing, E40 he tend to overshadow the other artists, and I mean, so many people I know, their favorite actually artist was Be Legit, because he's like really good. And Hemp Museum, what a great album. I think I brought copies of that to Amsterdam. I think I went to the Cannabis Cup over there that year. But they didn't say that. And so it was back in 1989. Scandalous, the tape, came out. And again, this is one of those ones that I don't know how many copies they made, but it was very underground, limited edition. And then later they would get signed to In a Minute Records. And once again, INP, the whole crew. But in particular, Kugnot, who sort of stood out. And that's not to, take away from any of the other artists, their members' talents. But, he was just like such a powerfully unique voice, his whole style, everything about it, and that raspy voice, so commanding. And the tragic thing is that, like so often happens in music, is that he wasn't really appreciated in his time. And now, in the later years, for many years now, but people have sort of appreciated it, but it's too bad because he's no longer with us. First heard them in 1992 with the release of their tape, A Lesson to Be Learned. And that was another one of those things where it was truly artists, an act who came, it was from the street upwards. So people on the street were totally into it. So you go anywhere, and people were, especially in San Francisco, people were bumping Lesson to Be Learned by RBL Posse. And then there's this song about Don't Gimme No Bammer that everybody gravitated towards. And then Jason Blaine, who ran In a Minute Records, he was like, yeah, we got to do this as a single and a video. So then they did a year later, even doing a radio version of it. And but RBL Posse were truly one of these groups who came straight from the streets. It was a long time before they sort of got recognition on the airwaves and other places, but they had the distinctive sound, and it represented, part of San Francisco, and went on. And of course, then tragedy would follow. But TC, the producer, was also responsible. And when you go back, it's like people. When you go back and you listen to a lot of these releases, like A Lesson to Be Learned, and you just listen to the production alone, it is mind-blowing. And it's like, honestly, I think that the music there was so much of it was coming out at the time that people couldn't fully digest it, because there were so many other things they were focused on. And also it takes time to kind of go back and listen, even with like a lot of the so-called mob gangster shit from the Bay. If you go back and listen to a lot of the stuff from the late 80s, early 90s, you hear a lot of scratching in there. And this is like hip-hop music, even though at the time it was not considered always hip-hop. Even though the Loonies were introduced to the world via Ice Cream Man on Drew Down's debut album when they were young guys, teens, it wasn't until 2 years later with I Got Five on it, their internationally huge hit that, it is a forever hit. You hear it to this day, and especially the remix of it, and that sort of changed everything and set them off on a career. Everyone knows he was a great artist, but he was a good person too, a real cool person. I got to know him. So I first met Mac Dre was through Kyrie, and it was after the Mac. So the Mac came first, and then Mac Dre came. I remember Kyrie saying that. And then, of course, one time when this is in the early 90s, so I had Mac Dre and Kyrie come on the radio show, I think in 1990. Anyway, and it was right after the Mac was killed, and they were just sort of talking about it and the shock of it. And anyway, so Mac Dre, I worked with him on these different things. I'm actually in this video of his, and got the whole thing was when he came out with this record, and it was just an amazing sound. And then Kyrie, the producer, who also people got to hear Mac Mall through him too, was such an influential figure. And that again, the funk music, with all of the different releases that dropped. And Young Black Brother records were truly influential in the Bay Area, and bringing like Mac Dre. And I think Mac Dre's death, in terms of people dying, I think ones that hit me hardest would have been Mac Dre, because I knew the guy personally and really liked him. He was a good guy. And then also Zumbi from Zion I, who more recently died, because I had just talked to him a few weeks before that. And, he was, again, so many artists from the Bay Area, everyone knows, like so many, the Jacka, different people who have died over the years here. And, obviously with rap music, hip-hop music being relatively young, all these people who died, they died prematurely. They died way before their time, and that's what makes them all really tragic. And it seems that in the Bay Area, there is so many great people who have died. Seagram is another person. I think Seagram, if he was still alive today, man, he could have been like as big as Pac, really. I think he was just like an amazing artist. And people like, they didn't quite, get him at first, or didn't listen, or didn't look out for him. A lot of times people didn't even know. They thought he was from Texas, from Houston, because he was on Rap-A-Lot records. But anyway, the Bay Area had so many different people who were talented and then tragically died, or were killed, or however, gone too young. Cougnut, for example, what a distinctive voice. He died. And again, you go online, you look up things, and sometimes you get the wrong information when you do a Google search. I read one thing where someone goes, oh yeah, he was killed, he was shot. He's like, no, he wasn't. He was killed in a car crash coming back from a fishing trip at, I think, age 33. And Cougnut and IMP, when they first came out, wow, scandalous. I mean, truly ahead of their time. And again, this is a period in Bay Area rap history, in San Francisco rap history, where people just put out tapes, and they only did like so many of them, a few hundred or something. And then In a Minute Records, in turn, picked up a lot of these different artists, most notably in the 90s, early 90s, IMP, RBL Posse, Dre Dog, later Andre Nicotina, and many, many, many more. Like Raleigh Rawl, EA Ski, and CMT went through In a Minute as well. So there was a lot going on. But so many of these artists were there making this music, which was from the streets of San Francisco, from Oakland, from Vallejo, Sacramento, so many great artists from Sacramento as well, Brother Lynch Hung, X-Rated, that generally speaking, hip-hop audiences, like say the Source magazine would have been the one, sort of the Bible of hip-hop, as it was called. So a lot of people looked to that. There were other magazines as well. But until Murder Dog came along, a lot of this music was not considered, real hip-hop by the gatekeepers of the culture. And as such, it's taken many years for people to catch up with, to appreciate the artistry of people like Cougnut and Ill Mannered Posse and Totally Insane. And of course, the Click, and you were talking about Down and Dirty. So for me, with this music, a lot of times as a DJ, I was in the right place, and as a journalist, I was in the right place. So I would always get advanced copies of stuff. So for this, this would have gone through City Hall distributors, independent distributors, because this is all independent. And that's another thing, if I could just say about Bay Area rap music / hip-hop, is that it wasn't just a music and an art form. It was a industry. It was a collective of entrepreneurs, African Americans doing something and making it work. Until, of course, guess what? The big labels came along, and then they were like, well, fuck it, man. We can't have these guys, these independent black entrepreneurs in the Bay Area making all this money, making $1 profit on every tape they sell. We got to get in. And that's basically what they did. And one of the questions that you had asked me was about Bay Area compilations, and that was a prime example where that was like the Bay Area at its finest, the independent labels putting out all of these things. And in fact, I brought this for you and for the director, and this a copy of this, which is the Bay Area Players. So I worked on this one with it, and it also, if you note, has the BART logo reappropriated in there. But anyway, but this was so to me, this was kind of the turning point. So this was put together by these guys, and they saw it sort of as a business opportunity. And then Stevie K worked on it as well, and it's really good. I think this was 1995, and then Bay Area Players was kind of
That's
like,
mine?
yeah, that's for you. That's because I have an extra copy. So it was kind of like the breaking point, where after that it was sort of downhill. So the Bay Area compilations, Herm Lewis. Trying to Survive in the Ghetto was the first one, but before that, like in '88, there was Too Short, Dangerous Music compilation, and that's how a lot of people, including myself, got introduced to Spice One, because he was on that from like in '88. But in terms of sort of the movement of Bay Area compilation that people think about, it was, of course, it was Herm Lewis, Trying to Survive in the Ghetto. Then Master P, who was still, hadn't gone back down to New Orleans, he was still in Richmond in the East Bay with No Limit Records, put out West Coast Bad Boys, the first one, which introduced people to Selsky, Stressed Out, one of the greatest songs of all time. The Predictor, yeah, Tutuk. And, so that one came out. Then D-Shot put out his compilation.
Boss Ballin', yeah.
Boss Ballin'. This one came out, the Bay Area Players. And then after that, for the second half of the 90s, there is some great ones, but there was so many that it's sort of
like
saturated. This is the pinnacle. And then after, and I think that the verses got better. I mean, not every artist, but when you listen to like late 90s compilations, some of the people who are on them, you can tell they were just kind of phoning it in. It wasn't as heartfelt as some of the earlier, like the verse. It was sort of like, I'll pay you so many thousand if you spit some, one verse on this or whatever it might have been.
I think the last good one from the 90s might be like 50-50 Chance or something like that.
Yeah, but there is so many of them. And the other thing is that it's so much that you kind of got to go back and re-listen to everything to fully appreciate it, because there's a lot of quality there too that got overlooked too.
Yeah, 'cause some of those ones, they might have like 5 good songs on them.
Rappin' Forte, which I guess could also be considered a Bay Area anthem, because it was just one of those songs that everybody totally fell in love with in the Bay Area. And I remember the first pressing of the single when it was still independent before they connected with Chrysalis EMI. Frankie J had it, and it was one of those ones where sometimes when you get something made up, pressed up, the volume was way too low or way too compressed, and they had to kind of redo the whole thing. But anyway, that was just sort of a technical thing. But the song itself was just a hit that took off, and people, and again, united the Bay Area. And I think Rappin' Forte just helped. He also inspired so many artists from San Francisco and the whole Bay Area, and kind of take it to the next level. How has the Bay Area environment changed since this era of the 90s? Well, one thing would be, as I mentioned, the whole business model. It being an out the trunk. I wrote this whole story for the Bay Guardian back in the mid 90s about this thing entitled Out the Trunk, and it was whereby the business model that so many independent, black-owned and operated independent record labels here in the Bay Area had. So it was really more of an industry, whereas now that has sort of shifted. And of course the whole internet and music sharing and that has changed the game too. But there was definitely, it was more of a homegrown, independent art, mom and pop run industry here back then. With a whole thriving industry surrounding it, with all of these studios that people would go to. And everybody, it was like a thriving business as well as an art form. And so many amazing people came out. The different magazines around, 4080 and Murder Dog, The Bomb Hip Hop. These were all like locally published magazines that just weighed in on this art form when other people, it appeared, wouldn't. And things have certainly shifted a lot since then. It's certainly more of a big industry now than before. Okay, so Souls of Mischief, 93 Till Infinity, is not only their most recognizable song forever, but it is also the year that marks their sort of coming into being. Even though they'd been around from the early 90s, they've been around, and they sort of came on up after Del the Funky Homo Sapien, Ice Cube's cousin, who sort of paved the way for the whole Hyro movement. And then I did interviews with them again, I think on early 93 rather, on KOSF San Francisco. They were on, and we had them on with Brown Fellini's doing kind of a live session back and forth. And what set Souls of Mischief, so in 93, when they released their, the first 2 singles and then the debut album, 93 Till Infinity, back then they were young. They were like 17, 18 years of age. They were very young. And they were different, because all of these other artists being discussed are more kind of mob, street, playa type music, whereas Souls of Mischief came along and they were more in the sort of like, was it kind of East Coast tradition of what hip hop was, but yet they were still Bay Area, and they were into Too Short and everything else. But they were very different, and even like their first videos with Michael Lucero, rest in peace, that were shot in these sort of rural places up in Mount Tam, or up out in the greenery, were quite different, because back then everyone would be like around a fire in the inner city doing their rap videos. So everything about them was quite different. So they were, in a way, they booked the whole trend of what the Bay Area, the stereotypical thing was known as sort of players, or sort of pimp, Mac Daddy, like Too Short was sort of more the player, or like the mob stuff, was what the Bay Area was known for, but it was so much deeper than that. And of course, Hobo Junction, who were sort of in between rap, so-called rap and so-called hip-hop, they were kind of just totally different. And then Mystic Journeyman came along, and the whole Living Legends crew, and how they helped redefine it. And then Souls of Mischief there, and so many different artists that people sometimes forget in the Bay Area, because they think of like the more, like they think of Sibo, they're going to think of, from Sacramento, they'll think of Too Short, they think of E40, they'll think of Drew Down and different people, but they forget like there were so many sort of groundbreaking artists, hip hop artists, who their style was totally different. It was more in the tradition of what the East Coast was known for at the time, and Souls of Mischief kind of helped sort of push that forward to realize in the Bay Area that it's such a diverse thing, because there's so many different styles here, including all of the turntablism and the scratching, and also the other forms that go with it too, including the aerosol art, aka the graffiti. Like in the Bay Area, people like the late great Mike Dream, who are truly leaders in a whole art movement. Sorry. When did I first hear In Too Deep, Back to the Hotel, which got released by Profile Records in 1992? I heard it in 1991 when Johnny Z from Rated Z Records, who produced the record, sent me a copy of it. Back then it was known as Telly, but it was on the LP called Back to the Hotel. See, there's Telly. Telly was the single, that was the name for it. And so they had this record, and they were, again, Johnny Z, Rated Z Records out of Vallejo. And what made Enter Deep different was that they were not black artists. So people saw them like, wait a minute, but then they were like, whoa, what is this sound? And they just fell in love with the sound. But anyway, Johnny Z thought, let me just send a copy of this this record we're putting out independently to Corey Robbins at Profile Records, home of so many people, DJ Quick, of course, Run DMC. And anyway, so sent it there, and they were like, Corey Robbins, who I worked for a while, also doing A&R on the West Coast, he just fell in love with it, and he was like, we got to put this out. And he had a great ear for hearing hit music, and that was one of them. And he was like, okay, this is a hit, and then released it, and it was amazing because that was that song that you heard everywhere, everybody's ride, that were bumping that, everywhere you went. And what a California Music Channel, it's a great channel. It's on every day. People come home from school and watch it. Back in the early 90s. There's other stations too. I used to be on Soul Beat and other channels doing hip-hop shows, and they were very influential. What made California Music Channel quite unique was that you could see it all over the Bay Area, so people saw it everywhere, and they supported local music. And Andy Kawanami and all the different people, including Chewy and people from the radio stations, were also on there, and it was a great way to hear and see new music, especially from the Bay, which they, like myself, took time to highlight and focus on, because that's what people wanted. And I think one thing that's changed is that it was more regional then. I mean, people now with the internet, they listen to music from all over, and back then I think it was like people in the Bay Area listened to Bay Area rap music, and I think that's something that's shifted, but at the time it's very important. People of Bay Area act who people just loved, and they did so well, ended up getting signed to Priority. There were certain record labels in LA and New York. Jive, Zamba, of course, is one. Priority Records is another, whereby they tapped in, and Profile Records I mentioned with In Too Deep, but they sort of tapped into the Bay Area. Pot and Deuce also were on Profile, and had this sort of relationship with them. But anyway, but the Delinquents were very, very talented, and had such a loyal listenership in Oakland and all over. There are some amazing artists that came out of Oakland, and one of the things, including Bad Influence, again associated with like Too Short and Cell Block Compilation and Rappin' Ron and Diddley Dog, were, I remember at the time when they first came out, it's interesting because back in the early 90s there was no social media. So you didn't go on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever and find out about, oh man, there's this thing. You would literally hear it from people. And if you waited, a whole month, you'd get to read the Source magazine or some of the other hip-hop magazines about these different artists. But a lot of times it was like literally through the streets, so people go talking about it. And I remember back at the time in Oakland that like different neighbors around Oakland would tell me about. They go, "Oh man, you got to check out these guys," and like they would know before anything came out. And what a great, unique sound. And again, I would file Bad Influence under artists that were just way ahead of their time and totally underappreciated. And sort of tragic how the group ended. Pimp of the Year. Drew Down came out with Chris Hicks, and at first some people thought Drew Down was a duo because there's these two individuals, but it was Chris Hicks, his manager, who ran the label, C Note Records, who appeared on the cover of the record, on the tape, the first one, and self-titled Drew Down. And also on that were the Loonies, and the two Loonies who people were introduced to. But also on that was Pimp of the Year. And an interesting thing about that, this is an example of censorship and how people hear music. So back then, KMEL would play that, but they played Mac of the Year. So radio stations played the radio version. So it wasn't Pimp of the Year, and he's talking about sucking dicks and pintos. No. It was cleaned up and sanitized for radio. And people would go to a club, and then they would hear the original X-rated version. And that's also sort of an example of censorship in rap/hip-hop music, and how some artists, like Drew Down for that, was very clever and innovative to just sort of completely change the name. Because otherwise, with radio versions, you have to take the word fuck or whatever and put it backwards, or put in like a drum beat or a gunshot in its place. But hereby, they did it. And also, NWA actually kind of were early on doing that too, where they, instead of the N-word, they used the brother word. And they did things with theirs where they changed the lyrics. But anyway, but Drew Down, Mac of the Year, aka Pimp of the Year, as everyone knows from listening to the tape, that was a good example of that. Describe the Bay Area's influence on the rap universe is a question that I would answer by saying, hella impactful. But seriously, I think the impact isn't really fully recognizable because you have to think of the big picture, and how it takes time. But, already, for many years, I've always thought like how, Too Short, there should be a statue to Too Short in downtown Oakland. There should have been one built there back in 1991. But the impact that the artists from the Bay Area have had on the whole world is incredible. And if you just listen to hip hop, I listen to music from all over, like brand new music that's coming out, and you'll hear the influence popping up. And back in the beginning with the artists from the Bay Area in the 90s, when they were doing their independent thing, they tended to, the most popular places that this music, that again was independent labels done through independent distributors like City Hall, who would get this music out. And there would be certain places like in the South and in places like Detroit where people just gravitated to the Bay Area music. And if you go back and you listen, you might hear an Atlanta group from 1995 or some group from Detroit or somewhere nearby in Michigan from that time, or maybe a year later, because usually it took a while for the seeds to be sown. But you can directly hear the influence of the Bay Area. And like even with the Deep South and Master P, again, another example going back, that carried on. This is back, in the 90s even, where the Bay Area was spreading that sound. And, I even hear like E40, I've heard people from overseas, different countries, doing their kind of take on his style, or, they're influenced by him, and it's quite obvious. But I would say that the Bay Area in hip-hop at large, in terms of the production, in terms of all of the DJs, all like the whole picture, not just gangster rap, and not just 90s, but music right up to now, is incredibly impactful and will continue to be so for years, and people haven't fully, comprehended it yet, because it really is a distinct, unique art form.